Mia Harris, a rising voice in the fight for racial justice, is invited to speak at a high-profile museum event, only to be racially profiled at the door and stopped from entering. As she stands in front of the crowd, will she expose the painful truth of what happened just moments before her speech? Or will she let the incident derail everything she's worked for? The ripple effect of her words could change everything, or nothing at all. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Mia's hands trembled slightly as she checked her watch, a delicate gold piece that had been a gift from her grandmother. The same grandmother who had always told her, "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as far, but you'll get there." Those words echoed in her mind as she approached the Grand Museum. Today was her moment, a culmination of years of work, struggle, and perseverance. She had been invited as the keynote speaker for an event highlighting racial justice and equality. As she approached the grand steps leading to the museum, her heart swelled with pride and anticipation. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blazer and slacks, Mia felt confident. She had rehearsed her speech countless times, and today she was ready. The museum itself was a towering structure of marble columns and intricate stonework, a symbol of prestige and intellect. In many ways, it felt surreal that she was about to walk into such an iconic venue, not as a visitor, but as the honored guest, ready to speak her truth and share her story. But her journey to this day had not been easy. Growing up, Mia had faced constant obstacles, many of which had been shaped by the color of her skin. She had endured the subtle, often invisible, biases that followed her from childhood into adulthood. And yet, she had managed to carve out a place for herself, not just as a survivor of prejudice, but as a voice against it. With a deep breath, she ascended the museum steps, her mind focused on the event ahead. As she neared the door, she spotted the uniformed security guard standing by the entrance. His posture was rigid, his face impassive. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Mia offered a polite smile, ready to introduce herself. Before she could speak, however, the guard stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his tone formal and stiff. "The museum is closed for a private event today." Mia blinked, momentarily confused. "I know," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm here for the event." The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning her from head to toe. His expression remained cold, bordering on suspicion. "You need an invitation to get in," he said firmly. "This is a private function." Mia's heart skipped a beat, the familiar sting of discomfort settling in her chest. "I'm the guest speaker," she explained, her voice still polite, but with an edge of frustration creeping in. "I was invited to speak here today. If you check your list, I'm sure you'll find my name, Mia Harris." The guard didn't move, his eyes still locked on her, as though weighing her words. "I wasn't told anything about a speaker," he muttered, almost dismissively. He glanced behind her as if expecting someone more appropriate to arrive. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Mia could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the email confirming her invitation. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "This is my confirmation. I'm supposed to be here." The guard barely glanced at the screen. "I'm going to need you to step aside," he said, gesturing to the side of the entrance. "I don't have time for this. You can wait here until I check." Mia felt her stomach knot. The humiliation of the moment began to settle in, but she wasn't ready to back down. She had faced too many moments like this in her life, and she wasn't going to let this one stop her. Before she could protest further, she noticed a group of guests approaching the entrance. Well-dressed, chatting amongst themselves. The guard stepped aside for them without a second thought, allowing them to pass without question. Not one of them had been asked to show an invitation or prove their reason for being there. A surge of frustration washed over her. The disparity in treatment was glaring. "Excuse me," Mia began again, her voice firmer this time. "I need to get inside. I have to prepare for my speech." The guard sighed heavily, looking her over once more. "Look, miss, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but you're going to need to wait until I get clearance." His tone was sharper now, a hint of irritation creeping in. "Why don't you just take a seat over there?" Mia's breath caught in her throat, the indignity of the moment almost overwhelming. She could feel the eyes of passers-by on her, some curious, others confused. The discomfort was suffocating. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being dismissed, ignored, and pushed aside. She had felt this kind of prejudice before, but it stung anew every time. Here she was, a highly educated, accomplished woman, yet this guard couldn't see past his assumptions about her. Just as Mia opened her mouth to argue further, she heard a voice calling out from inside the museum. "Mia, there you are." The voice belonged to Mrs. Halverson, the museum's director, a middle-aged woman with a warm, welcoming demeanor. She hurried toward them, her face flushing with embarrassment as she took in the scene. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Halverson said, shooting an apologetic glance at Mia. "There's been a mistake." The guard stiffened, his eyes widening as he realized his error. "I didn't know," he stammered, stepping aside quickly. "I didn't realize she was the speaker." "It's fine," Mia replied, though it was far from fine. The humiliation still clung to her, heavy and unshakable. Mrs. Halverson looked horrified. "Mia, please, come inside. I can't believe this happened. I'll have a word with the security team right away." Mia gave a tight smile, her voice measured. "Thank you." She allowed herself to be ushered inside, away from the stairs, away from the guard's belated apologies. But the moment lingered in her mind, gnawing at her. As they walked through the museum's grand halls, Mia tried to push the incident from her thoughts, but it refused to fade. This wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. It didn't matter how accomplished she became, how many stages she stood on, or how many speeches she gave, there would always be moments like this. Moments where she would be judged by the color of her skin before anyone even bothered to ask her name. By the time they reached the reception area, Mia's confidence had been shaken. She had worked so hard to prepare for this day. But now, all she could think about was the humiliation she had just endured. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was about to give a speech on racial profiling and systemic discrimination, and she had just been a victim of the very things she was here to talk about. Mrs. Halverson patted her arm reassuringly. "I'm so sorry again, Mia. This was absolutely unacceptable. I'll make sure it never happens again." Mia nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you," she said, but her mind was elsewhere. As she stood in the grand hall surrounded by art and history, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. The incident with the guard had been a stark reminder of the barriers she still faced, even in spaces where she was supposed to be celebrated. And as she prepared to deliver her speech, Mia knew that the personal had just become political. This was no longer just about statistics or stories from the past. This was her story, unfolding in real time. And now, more than ever, she was determined to make sure it was heard. Inside the museum's grand halls, the event was already well underway. The soft murmur of voices and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air as attendees mingled beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. The walls were adorned with art from various cultures, and the air carried the quiet, respectful ambiance of a high society gathering. Mia stood near the edge of the room, observing the scene while trying to shake off the unpleasantness of her interaction with the security guard outside. But no matter how much she tried, the sting of that moment lingered. She'd been invited here as the keynote speaker, a distinguished guest meant to shine a light on the very issues she had just experienced firsthand. Racial profiling. The unfair assumptions people make about others based solely on appearance. The irony of it wasn't lost on her. It never was. As much as she wanted to focus on the event, the weight of what had happened outside pressed heavily on her chest. People approached her now, offering polite smiles and handshakes, unaware of the humiliation she had just endured. They praised her accomplishments, expressed excitement for her upcoming speech, and asked about her work. Mia returned their pleasantries, smiling in all the right places, but her mind kept replaying the interaction with the guard. The dismissiveness, the assumption that she didn't belong, it was a narrative she knew too well. She glanced at her phone, seeing a missed text from her best friend Tasha. It simply read, "Good luck today. You're going to kill it. Let me know how it goes." Mia hesitated before typing a reply. She wanted to tell Tasha about what had happened, about how, once again, she'd been reminded that no matter how far she came, there would always be people who saw her as lesser. But she didn't want to seem defeated. Not today. Thanks. I'm about to go on soon. We'll text you after, she sent back instead. Mia slipped her phone into her bag and took a deep breath. She couldn't let one moment of prejudice define the entire day. Her speech was supposed to uplift, to inspire. This was her moment to stand in front of these people and speak the truth. Yet, how could she do that when the truth felt so raw? A voice from behind startled her out of her thoughts. Mia, you're next on stage. It was Mrs. Halverson, her face still carrying a shadow of embarrassment over what had happened outside. Again, I can't apologize enough for the misunderstanding. I've already spoken to security about it. Mia smiled faintly, though the sentiment did little to soothe her. Thank you, she said. I'm fine. But she wasn't, not really. The experience with the guard had unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate yet. It was the kind of wound that stung, not because it was new, but because it had reopened scars that were old and deeply rooted. As she walked toward the podium, Mia could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. They were eager to hear what she had to say. Her speech had been billed as one of the key highlights of the event, an address that would tackle difficult subjects head-on. She had carefully crafted her words to be both enlightening and uncomfortable, a necessary push toward awareness and change. But now, as she approached the stage, she felt the words she had planned to say dissolve into something more personal. The large wooden podium stood on a platform, elevated slightly above the sea of attendees. Mia stepped behind it, taking a moment to adjust the microphone. Her hands felt cold, and she could sense the undercurrent of expectation in the room. She had prepared for this, rehearsed it over and over, yet the day's events had thrown her off balance. She cleared her throat, glancing out at the faces watching her. There was a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Some were familiar with her work, others perhaps less so, but all of them were here to listen. Good evening, she began, her voice steady but her heart racing. I'd like to start by thanking the museum for inviting me here today. It's an honor to speak in such a prestigious space, surrounded by so much history and culture. A polite round of applause followed. Mia paused, looking down briefly at the notes she had laid out before her. The speech she had so carefully crafted seemed inadequate now. The perfectly polished paragraphs felt too rehearsed, too impersonal. Instead, she made a decision, one that surprised even her. I had prepared a speech, she continued, her voice gaining strength. A speech filled with facts and figures about racial inequality, about systemic discrimination. But I'm not going to read that tonight. There was a ripple of murmurs in the audience, and Mia caught a few surprised glances exchanged between guests. This wasn't what they had been expecting. I'm not going to read that because something happened to me today, just a few hours ago, right outside these doors. She could feel the room shift, the attention sharpening, as her words hung in the air. Something that reminded me of why I do the work I do. The murmurs died down, replaced by a heavy silence. Mia could sense the unease growing in the room. This wasn't the smooth, polished keynote speech they had anticipated. This was real. Raw. I arrived here today, excited, honored to be a part of this event, she continued, her voice unwavering now. But before I could even step inside, I was stopped by a security guard. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't ask who I was or what I was doing here. He just assumed, based on the way I look, that I didn't belong. He told me I needed an invitation to enter. He looked me up and down and made a decision about me without ever knowing who I was. A few people in the audience exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mia saw Mrs. Halverson lower her head slightly, clearly regretting the earlier incident. I tell you this not to make anyone here feel uncomfortable, but because this is the reality that so many of us face every single day. No matter how far we come, no matter what we achieve, we are constantly reminded that we are seen as other. We are reminded that the color of our skin, our appearance, is enough for people to make assumptions about who we are and what we deserve. The silence in the room was palpable. Every eye was fixed on Mia, and she could feel the weight of her words settling over the audience. This isn't just my story, Mia continued, her voice softening slightly. This is the story of so many people who look like me, We walk into rooms every day where we are not expected, where we are not welcomed, and where we are not seen for who we truly are. And that is what we are fighting to change. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room remained silent, the atmosphere thick with tension, but it was the kind of tension that Mia knew was necessary. Change didn't come from comfort. It came from confronting the hard truths. Mia looked down at her notes one last time, but they seemed irrelevant now. The carefully constructed speech no longer mattered. What mattered was this moment, the honesty of it, the vulnerability. So, tonight, she said, I'm not going to give you the facts and figures. I'm not going to tell you what you already know. Instead, I'm asking you to think about what it feels like to be constantly questioned, to be constantly judged, not for what you've done, but for what you look like. I'm asking you to imagine how that shapes a person, how it weighs on them. Her voice softened, and I'm asking you to help change that. Not through speeches or events like this, but through your actions, your decisions, your willingness to see people, really see them. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that typically followed such speeches. This was something deeper. Mia could see it in their faces. Some nodded thoughtfully, others wiped away tears, and a few stared at her, eyes wide, as if seeing something new for the first time. Mia stepped down from the podium, her heart still racing, but this time for a different reason. She had come here to deliver a message, but in the end, it was the day's events that had delivered the message to her. This was the work she had chosen to do, the hard work, the necessary work, and even in the face of prejudice, she knew she would continue to do it. As she walked away from the stage, she caught a glimpse of the security guard standing near the back of the room. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly, and Mia gave him a small, quiet nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was acknowledgement. They both knew what had happened. Now it was time to move forward. As Mia stepped down from the podium, the applause still ringing in her ears, her mind drifted to the journey that had led her to this moment. She had always known her path wouldn't be easy. Growing up as a black girl, in a predominantly white neighborhood, she had learned early on that she would need to fight for her place in the world. What she hadn't expected was just how relentless that fight would be, and how often she would have to prove her worth to those who couldn't or wouldn't see it. After her speech, a handful of attendees approached her with warm smiles and soft words of congratulations, their faces reflecting admiration for the powerful message she had delivered. Mia nodded and thanked them, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The crowd slowly thinned as the evening continued, and Mia found herself wandering through the museum's exhibits, seeking a quiet corner where she could reflect. She stopped in front of a large painting, a portrait of a woman from centuries ago, regal and poised, her gaze distant and serene. Mia studied the brushstrokes, the way the artist had captured the essence of this woman's power and grace. But her mind was elsewhere, wandering back through the corridors of her own life, to the moments that had shaped her. She had been 8 years old the first time she realized that she was different. She remembered the day vividly. It had been her turn to bring cupcakes to class for her birthday, and she had spent the night before carefully decorating each one with her mother. They had been perfect. Bright pink icing, sprinkles, and a little star-shaped candy on top of each one. Mia had been so excited to share them with her classmates. But when she walked into the classroom, cupcakes in hand, she was greeted by a few curious stares. As she handed them out, she overheard a group of girls whispering behind her. "Why does her skin look like that?" One of them had asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Another had giggled, a sound that felt like a sharp jab to Mia's heart. Mia had paused, her smile fading as she looked down at her hands, suddenly aware of the color of her skin in a way she hadn't been before. The laughter felt like an echo that followed her throughout the day, and even though the teacher had praised the cupcakes, Mia no longer felt the joy she had that morning. That was the first time she truly felt different. The first time she realized that not everyone saw her the way she saw herself. Her mother had been there to comfort her when she returned home, her voice gentle but firm. "You are beautiful, Mia," she had said, pulling her close, And don't you ever let anyone make you feel like you're not. There's nothing wrong with the way you look. Mia had nodded, but the seed of doubt had been planted. It was a small moment, just a few thoughtless words, but it had stayed with her. She learned that day that the world would always find a way to remind her of her differences, even in the smallest ways. Mia moved away from the painting, wandering deeper into the gallery. She passed by sculptures, ancient artifacts, and historical documents, all of which spoke to the legacies of those who came before her. And in each piece, Mia could feel the weight of history. The untold stories, the voices that had been silenced, the lives that had been shaped by forces beyond their control. In many ways, her own story felt like a continuation of those legacies. Her mind wandered to her high school years, a time that had been both challenging and transformative. She had always been a strong student, but it hadn't taken long for her to notice how differently she was treated compared to her white peers. Teachers had often seemed surprised by her intelligence, their compliments always tinged with a hint of condescension. "You're so articulate," one teacher had told her after a class presentation, as if it was a revelation. The comment had been meant as praise, but it left Mia feeling small. Did he expect her to be anything else? The implication was clear. He hadn't expected her to be as smart or well-spoken as she was. That was the beginning of a pattern, one where Mia was constantly underestimated, overlooked, or treated as an anomaly. In many ways, those experiences had fueled her determination to succeed, to prove that she was just as capable as anyone else, if not more so. She had pushed herself in academics, joined clubs, and excelled in extracurricular activities, all while carrying the unspoken burden of being the exception in a world that often expected less of her. As she wandered into another room, Mia found herself in front of a striking black and white photograph of a civil rights march. The faces of the men and women in the image were filled with defiance and hope, their bodies pressed together as they marched down the street, banners and signs raised high. Mia felt a sense of connection to them, as if their fight was still alive in her today. In many ways it was. College had been a turning point for her. It was there, amidst the diversity of students and professors, that Mia began to find her voice as an activist. She joined campus organizations dedicated to social justice, and it was there that she truly began to understand the depth and complexity of the systems of oppression she had been fighting her whole life. She had learned about systemic racism, institutional bias, and how deeply ingrained prejudice was in society. It wasn't just about individual acts of discrimination, it was about the way entire structures were built to keep certain groups of people down. Mia had organized rallies, led protests, and spoken out at student government meetings. She had made friends with others who shared her passion, and together they had pushed for change. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. She had become known on campus as someone who wasn't afraid to speak up, to challenge authority, to demand justice. And yet, even in those spaces, she had faced resistance. She remembered one particular rally where she had been giving a speech about racial profiling. It had been a peaceful protest, a gathering of students who wanted to raise awareness about the issues that were so often ignored. But as she spoke, she noticed a group of police officers gathering at the edge of the crowd, their presence heavy and intimidating. One of the officers had approached her afterward, his tone less than friendly. "You need to be careful with the things you're saying," he had warned, his eyes cold. "You don't want to incite anything." Mia had stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not inciting anything," she had replied calmly. "I'm speaking the truth." But the officer hadn't backed down. "Just watch yourself," he had said before walking away, leaving her with a sense of unease that lingered long after the rally had ended. As Mia continued to walk through the museum, her thoughts turned back to the present. The incident with the security guard earlier that evening had stirred up so many memories, so many moments where she had been reminded of her place in a world that often tried to keep her in the margins. It wasn't just about the guard or the way he had dismissed her so easily. It was about the lifetime of experiences that had led to this moment. Each time she had been questioned, each time she had been made to feel less than, it had left a mark. And yet, Mia had used those moments to fuel her determination. She had chosen to fight back, not with anger, but with grace, intelligence, and perseverance. She had turned her pain into purpose, using her platform to speak for those who couldn't, to demand change where it was needed most. Now, as she prepared to leave the gallery and return to the crowd, Mia felt a renewed sense of resolve. The journey hadn't been easy, and it wouldn't get easier. But if her life had taught her anything, it was that the battles she fought were worth it. She had spent years pushing against the tide of prejudice, and she would continue to do so for as long as it took. The fight for justice was never ending, but Mia was ready to keep fighting. For herself, for those who came before her, and for the generations yet to come. Mia returned to the reception area, her thoughts still swirling from the emotional reflections stirred by her time in the gallery. The faces of the past, those captured in the artwork and photographs, seemed to follow her, their silent determination reminding her of the weight of the legacy she carried. This wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of countless others who had come before her, and countless others who would follow. It was a heavy burden, but Mia was used to carrying it. As she rejoined the gathering, the conversations were more subdued than they had been before her speech. She could sense a shift in the room. The polite smiles and casual small talk had been replaced with thoughtful expressions and a quieter atmosphere. Mia wasn't surprised. Her speech had been raw, and it had likely unsettled many of the attendees. That was what she had wanted. Change didn't come from comfort, and sometimes people needed to be shaken from their complacency. A few people approached her, their words carefully chosen, their faces solemn. They congratulated her on her bravery, on her willingness to speak truth to power. One older woman, dressed in a designer gown and pearls, took Mia's hand in hers. "You were incredible," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never really thought about things the way you described them. Your words, they made me realize how much I've taken for granted." Mia nodded, offering a warm smile, though her heart was still heavy. She appreciated the woman's sentiment, but this wasn't about gratitude. It was about action. Real change required more than kind words. It required people to reflect, to challenge themselves, to actively work against the systems that perpetuated inequality. "Thank you," Mia replied softly. "I hope that my words can inspire more than just reflection. I hope they inspire change." The woman nodded, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "They will," she whispered before squeezing Mia's hand and stepping away. Mia watched her go, feeling a familiar mix of emotions. She had learned, over the years, that for every person who truly listened, there were others who simply heard, but didn't absorb. She had seen it before. The well-meaning people who offered praise and sympathy, but who ultimately returned to their comfortable lives without altering anything. But she had also seen people change. She had witnessed firsthand the power of words and how the right message, delivered at the right moment, could ignite something in a person. As the evening wore on, Mia found herself standing near a large window, gazing out at the city beyond. The lights flickered in the distance, and the streets buzzed with the movement of people going about their lives, unaware of the small revolution that had just taken place within the museum's walls. A part of her longed to be out there, among them, free from the weight of expectations, the constant scrutiny, the endless need to prove herself. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it was Tasha calling. Mia answered, grateful for the familiar voice on the other end. "Mia." Tasha's voice was bright and full of excitement. "How did it go? Tell me everything." Mia leaned against the window, her eyes drifting over the city lights. "It went well," she said, though the word didn't quite capture the complexity of her feelings. "It wasn't exactly what I had planned, though. Something happened before I even got into the building." Tasha's tone immediately shifted. "What happened? Are you okay?" Mia hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to articulate the anger, the frustration, and the sadness that had bubbled up inside her after the incident with the security guard. "I was stopped at the door," she said finally, her voice steady but tight. "The security guard wouldn't let me in. He thought I didn't belong." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Tasha's voice, soft but fierce. "Mia, I'm so sorry. That's awful." "It's not surprising, though, is it?" Mia replied with a bitter laugh. "I should have expected it, but it just It hit me harder than I thought it would. It felt like all the progress I've made, all the work I've done, meant nothing in that moment. I was just another black woman, standing outside a door, being told I didn't belong. Tasha's sigh was heavy, filled with understanding. That's the worst part, isn't it? No matter how much we achieve, no matter how far we come, there's always someone ready to remind us that, in their eyes, we're still just other. Mia nodded, though Tasha couldn't see her. Exactly. But you know what? I used it. I went off script for my speech. I told them what happened, right there in the room. I laid it all out for them, how it feels to constantly be questioned, to constantly have to prove yourself, even when you're standing in a place you've been invited to. And I think it hit them. I think some of them finally understood. There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Tasha spoke again, her voice full of admiration. That's why you're incredible, Mia. You take these horrible, painful moments, and you turn them into something powerful. You always have. Mia smiled, her heart warming slightly at her friend's words. I hope so, she said softly. I really do, but sometimes it feels like an uphill battle. It is an uphill battle, Tasha agreed, but you're not fighting it alone. There are people out there, people like me and so many others who are standing with you. And the work you're doing, the words you're speaking, they're making a difference. You might not see it every day, but I promise you it's happening. Mia felt a surge of gratitude for her friend, for the unwavering support Tasha had always offered her. Thanks, Tash, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I needed to hear that. Anytime, Tasha replied, her voice gentle. And remember, you're allowed to feel tired, you're allowed to be frustrated, but don't ever doubt that you're making a difference. You've got this. Mia smiled, feeling a bit lighter. You're the best, you know that? I try, Tasha said with a laugh. Now, get some rest. You've earned it, and when you're ready, call me again and we'll talk about all the amazing things you're going to do next. Mia ended the call, her heart full. Tasha was right. The work was hard, and it was exhausting, but it was also necessary. And as much as she felt the weight of the fight pressing down on her, she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. She turned away from the window, her gaze sweeping over the room. The crowd had thinned even more, with only a few stragglers left, chatting quietly in small groups. Mia's eyes landed on the security guard from earlier, who was standing near the entrance, his posture slightly slouched, as if he were deep in thought. For a moment, Mia considered walking over to him, confronting him directly about what had happened earlier. But as she watched him, she saw something in his expression that gave her pause. Regret, perhaps, or shame. His face, once hardened with authority, now looked softened, almost vulnerable. Mia didn't know what he was thinking, but she hoped that her words, her story, had reached him in some small way. That maybe, just maybe, the next time he saw someone like her standing at the door, he would think twice before making assumptions. She walked toward the exit, her steps light but purposeful. The night was dark and cool as she stepped outside, and the city seemed quieter now, almost peaceful. Mia took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs. As she made her way down the steps of the museum, she felt a sense of closure. The day had not gone as she had planned, but in many ways, it had been more powerful than she could have imagined. She had spoken her truth, and people had listened. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. The city was alive with the hum of traffic, distant music, and the occasional shout from passers-by. But as Mia walked down the museum steps, leaving the grand event behind her, she felt a quiet sense of stillness within. It wasn't peace, not entirely, but it was something close to it, a sense of resolve. The night had been an emotional whirlwind, filled with unexpected turns. But in the end, Mia knew she had done what she set out to do. She had spoken her truth, and for once, she had made people listen. As Mia reached the sidewalk, her phone buzzed again. She checked the screen, expecting another message from Tasha or a notification from social media. Instead, it was an email, its subject line catching her eye, a thank you from a stranger. Curious, Mia opened it. Dear Mia, I wanted to reach out to you after hearing your speech tonight. I was one of the attendees at the event, and I have to be honest, I wasn't expecting to hear what you said. I came here thinking I already knew what there was to know about racial profiling and discrimination. I thought I understood. But listening to you, It was like a light bulb went off in my head. Your words made me realize how much I've been blind to, even when I thought I was being aware. I've always considered myself an open-minded person, but I never really thought about the everyday experiences of people like you. I never thought about how much it must hurt to be questioned, to be told in subtle and not so subtle ways that you don't belong. Your story and the way you told it changed me. I won't forget it. I just wanted to thank you for that. I know this might not seem like much, coming from someone you don't know, but I promise you, your words had an impact on me, and I'm going to do my part to make sure I don't contribute to the problem anymore. Thank you for being brave enough to share your truth. Best. A stranger who's learning. Mia stood on the sidewalk, reading the email twice, then a third time. A small smile tugged at her lips, though it was tinged with a bittersweet edge. These were the moments that made it all worth it. The moments when she could feel the ripple of her words spreading beyond the immediate room, touching people she would never have known otherwise. This was what she had been fighting for all along, to make people see, to make them understand. The night air was cool against her skin as Mia began her walk home. She could have called a cab or taken the subway, but tonight, she needed the solitude. The rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement felt grounding, and with each step, she could feel the tension of the day slowly beginning to fade. Her mind drifted back to her childhood again, to the first time she had felt that sharp sting of being seen as different, as less. It wasn't just the cupcakes or the whispers in the classroom. It was a lifetime of moments. The subtle looks from neighbors, the hushed comments from store clerks, the unspoken judgments in places where she was supposed to feel safe. All those small, seemingly insignificant incidents had piled up over the years, like stones in a backpack, weighing her down bit by bit. And yet, she had carried that weight with her, refusing to let it break her. Instead, she had turned it into fuel. Every hurtful glance, every dismissive comment had driven her to work harder, to speak louder, to make sure that her voice, and the voices of those who had been silenced for too long, would be heard. The world had changed in some ways, Mia knew. There were more conversations about race and inequality now than ever before. People were starting to wake up to the realities that had long been ignored. But change was slow, and it was hard. And Mia understood better than most that progress didn't come in a straight line. It came in waves, with each ripple building on the last, until, one day, the tide finally turned. The following morning, Mia woke early, still feeling the emotional weight of the previous day. She had spent hours lying awake, replaying her speech in her mind, thinking about the security guard, the attendees, and the email from the stranger. Her thoughts had swirled with both pride and exhaustion. But now, as the sun filtered through her window, casting soft golden light across her bedroom, she felt a sense of clarity. She sat up in bed, reaching for her laptop. As the screen flickered to life, she saw that her inbox was already filling up with messages from people who had attended the event, along with social media notifications from others who had heard about her speech through word of mouth. Mia scrolled through the messages, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. There were more emails like the one from the stranger, messages from people who had been moved by her words, people who had started to question their own assumptions and biases. Some of the messages were long and thoughtful, others were brief but heartfelt, each one a testament to the impact her speech had made. But there was one email that caught her attention more than the others. It was from Mrs. Halverson, the museum director. Mia opened it, her eyes scanning the text. Dear Mia, I wanted to thank you again for your incredible speech last night. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I've come to realize just how much we still need to learn as an institution. I'm ashamed that the incident with the security guard happened on our watch, and I want you to know that we're taking steps to address it. I've already spoken to the security team, and we'll be implementing new training focused on racial sensitivity and awareness. But I also realize that training isn't enough. We need to do more than just react when something goes wrong. We need to be proactive in creating a space where everyone feels welcome and respected. I would love to discuss ways we can work together to make this museum, and others like it, more inclusive and accessible to all. Please let me know if you'd be willing to meet and continue this conversation. I believe we can make real change here, and I'd be honored to have your guidance as we move forward. With deepest gratitude, Rachel Halverson. Mia sat back, her mind racing. This was more than she had expected. She had hoped her speech would spark conversation, maybe even inspire some reflection. But this was real action. The idea of working with the museum to implement tangible changes, to create a space where people like her would be welcomed without hesitation, it was more than she had dared to hope for. She thought back to the security guard, to the look of regret on his face as he stood at the back of the room during her speech. Maybe he, too, had been changed by what he had heard. Maybe he would think twice the next time someone who didn't fit his assumptions approached the door. Maybe, just maybe, the ripple effect of her words would continue to spread. Mia took a deep breath, feeling a sense of purpose settle over her. This was what she had been fighting for. Not just the speeches, not just the words, but the real, concrete change that could come from them. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Mia felt hopeful. She quickly typed a reply to Mrs. Halverson, agreeing to meet and discuss next steps. Then, with a sense of renewed determination, she closed her laptop and stood, ready to face the day. There was still so much work to be done, but Mia knew now that she wasn't fighting alone. The ripple of change had begun, and she was ready to see where it would lead. Months later, Mia stood outside the museum again, but this time things felt different. She had been working closely with the museum's leadership, helping to implement new policies and practices that would ensure everyone, regardless of their background, felt welcome. The security team had undergone extensive training, and there were new initiatives in place to highlight artists and speakers from marginalized communities. As Mia entered the building, the same security guard from that fateful night greeted her. He smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes, and opened the door for her without hesitation. "Good to see you again, Miss Harris," he said, his voice friendly and respectful. Mia smiled back. "Good to see you too." As she walked through the halls of the museum, now filled with even more diverse art and history, Mia felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today she could see the results of her work. Change had begun, and for the first time she truly believed that it would continue. The ripple had become a wave. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.